Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about the Empire in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, to talk about their strengths and their weaknesses, the pros and the cons with regards to playing the Empire. Now, the Empire is probably the most popular race in the game, or one of the most popular races in the game, at least for people that have access to them. Like, if you've just bought Warhammer 3, that is a different discussion. Obviously, we consider Cathay or Kislev, but I think for people that do own Warhammer 1 at the very least, the Empire is the most popular race by far. It's a fairly comfortable race to play. And one of their biggest strengths is that they have an answer for pretty much every situation except with regards to their flying roster, because they don't have a flying roster. But when it comes to their units, they have a good selection of infantry, not the best in the world, but a decent number of infantry units, a huge selection of cavalry units, range units, artillery units, casters. So you can't go wrong playing it as the Empire. Now, not having flying units is a downside, but let's consider the following aspect. At Tier 1, the situation isn't particularly great, because the only unit that's good at recruiting at Tier 1 is Pistoliers, because swordsmen, spearmen with shields, well, spearmen with shields are decent frontline holders, but you do have better ones available just one tier above. But really, between archers, pistoliers, spearmen with shields, there's not really a great selection at Tier 1. And by the way, this is actually a downside, because some really great races have really good Tier 1 units. Like, consider the High Elves with their archers, or even the Greenskins with their goblin archers. Those are really good Tier 1 units. This is a downside for the Empire compared to a lot of races. But on the flip side, at Tier 2, you start getting things like crossbowmen, halberdiers. Halberdiers are not the best line holders, but against early game chaff, they are going to get the job done. And they do most of their damage as armor piercing. The problem is the auto-resolve situation with them, and the fact that their lack of armor does mean they'll take a lot more damage than other units. But still, that is an upside. Then you get Empire Knights. Pretty good cavalry unit, heavily armored cavalry unit over here. And most importantly, you get Outriders, Handgunners, and pretty much every single hero type for the Empire at Tier 2. Not in terms of increasing their capacity, but in terms of being able to recruit them. And let me say this, being able to recruit engineers, warrior priests, witch hunters, captains, and even mages at Tier 2 is a fairly substantial benefit in your campaign, because it gives you that kind of early game variety that other races would scream for. This is actually one of the problems. Like, there are races in the game that are exceptionally good at certain things, but it is locked behind higher tiers. This is one of the significant upsides. Like, even very early on, you have good selection of ranged units, good selection of cavalry, good selection of skirmisher cavalry, and heroes. And then at Tier 3, you increase every single hero capacity that you do have. And now for Karl Franz, you do need Tier 3 because you can't recruit a regular mage building over here. Get a regular mage building. You can only get the Altar of Conclave of Battle Wizards from your provincial capital. But it is a very substantial benefit. And quite crucially, because you can increase your hero capacity at Tier 3 for everything except mages, it means that you can have a lot of heroes running around in the campaign. And then at Tier 3, we also get things like greatswords. And greatswords, again, the Empire doesn't have the best infantry in the world, but greatswords are fairly solid units. More expensive, of course, than other units you have, but still, between greatswords, huntsmen, Nolan Ironsides, Hockland long rifles, Outriders with grenade launchers, Knights of the Blazing Sun, Knights of the Black Rose, Reichsguard, cannons, you have a really, really good selection of units. Your high-end units may not necessarily be the most sought after. Like, personally, at least this is my experience, I barely ever bother recruiting lance ships, because by the time I can get access to them, I've pretty much won the campaign. It is a bit of a shame with Hellstorm rocket batteries, but to be honest, you don't necessarily need them. Point is, you have a great selection early on with most units. The downside here your infantry is not going to stand up to the infantry of many other races in the game. That is a downside. So you're going to rely on hit and run tactics. You're going to rely on your cavalry. You're going to rely on your range units, magic, all that. And the biggest downside, I would say, with regards to the Imperial roster is their lack of flying units. You do have flying heroes and flying generals, but you don't have flying units. And that is a pretty big downside, because there are races like the dwarves, for instance, who can really decimate opponents with their flying capability. There's only a handful of races in the game that don't really have a good flying roster, or any kind of flying roster, and the Empire is certainly one of them from my perspective. Just having flying heroes does not count from my point of view. Having actual flying units is kind of important, because it allows you to deal with their enemy artillery line. It allows you to deal with enemy range units. That kind of stuff is important. In some ways, the Empire, for all its versatility, actually is behind Cathay, for instance, because Cathay has a lot of really good infantry units, better than Empire, has really good range units, though doesn't have the same kind of gunpowder power, or in terms of like artillery power, siege tank power, blind ship power that the Empire has. But still, the Empire is in a pretty good space over here. And the fact that they have easy access to replenishment, easy access to movement range for the engineer, does allow them to run in circles around their opponents on their campaign map, take fights that other people wouldn't be able to take as easily, because they would take casualties that they wouldn't be able to recover from. Their economy is in a pretty decent space. Not the greatest economy in the world, but gets the job done considering the situation. So that's what with respect to the Empire unit roster, hero roster. Actually, in terms of generals, let's talk about this. You have generals of the Empire, arch-lectors, huntsman general, and master engineers. Now, from my point of view, huntsman generals kind of aren't too important these days, but arch-lectors did get nerfed. But generals of the Empire have become far more useful at leading an army of men than they were before, primarily because they've gotten the skill line choices that they didn't have before. So generals of the Empire were basically a stat stick type general. But now they're pretty solid because they have the Imperial Griffin as a mount. They can either get a significant amount of combat ability, or they can increase replenishment, local recruitment capacity, recruitment cost, reduce upkeep, get leadership, which is pretty important, by the way, considering the situation, and also increase the experience gain for their army. The one downside, if you will, for the Empire in terms of their generals is they don't have a caster general, but they have a general that can ride a freaking siege tank. But there's also more to that. You also get the noble trait, which reduces construction time by 25%. So while your generals aren't the very best in the world compared to other races, you do have, again, versatility. But that's with respect to like the Empire in isolation, if you will. Then there is the question of Imperial Authority. Imperial Authority used to suck, but now it's a pretty great system for every single legendary lord that deals with territory in the Empire. Only applies in the actual Empire. It incentivizes you to keep the Empire unified, and this is great from a couple of perspectives. Because beforehand, you wouldn't really care too much, even as Karl Franz or Gelt, you wouldn't care too much about like keeping their Empire unified. But now, you benefit quite a bit from doing so, because you can always confederate the elector counts. It's much easier to confederate a minor faction than it is a major faction, and since these are all minor factions, but they still have a substantial number of AI buffs available to them, you can actually benefit from these factions just building up these settlements very quickly, much quickly than you would, and then just confederating them. This especially works well for Karl Franz, who has the electoral machinations ability to unify elector counts for prestige. So that is a nice benefit over there. It means that keeping these minor factions, which in a lot of campaigns, I gotta tell you this, when it comes to dealing with minor factions, they're not worth the hassle. Like, for a vast majority of races, you don't really care about them. But for Empire, you can benefit from keeping them alive. You can have, like, very little territory, for instance, in Empire, say Karl Franz, expand somewhere else or not expand at all. But as long as you keep these electric counts intact, you can eventually benefit from these quite substantially through that confederation, because you will be, to some extent or another, be guaranteed confederation even if you're playing other other legendary lords of the Empire. So that is a nice upside. The downside is that the AI is, well, the AI in Warhammer 3. So with that particular weakness. So it's kind of like herding cats to some extent, though the payoff is there. It didn't really quite exist before, because confederating with the previous system of Imperial authority was a freaking nightmare to deal with. But either way, that is a substantial upside from my perspective. Really adds flavor to the Empire. Then let's talk about the legendary lords of the Empire, and also climate situation. I'll get to the research tree towards the very end of it. Now, climate, the Empire is not necessarily in the very best spot, though if you're playing as Gelt, you do get mountains, and that is a fairly substantial benefit. Or if you're playing Volkmar, you get Wasteland. But the thing about legendary lords is you have the trio, the golden trio of the Empire. You have Karl Franz, Gelt, and Elspeth. So you have Elspeth over here in Nuln, and you have Gelt over here in Cathay, where you can stay in Cathay or return to the Empire, or you can cheese the shit out of the campaign. And the thing about it, the thing about these legendary lords, Karl Franz has some limitations with regards to, say, declaring war on, electric counts, because he would lose fealty with all others, and that is not something you want to happen. But Elspeth and Gelt have no such limitation. They don't have the benefit of guaranteed confederation through unification, but they do have more versatility from that perspective. Karl Franz is focused on the diplomacy and economic aspect, and quite crucially, Unify can work with any Imperial faction across the world once you do upgrade it through research and the Emperor of the Empire, which improves your decrees. Basically, they took Jan Bo with Karl Franz and actually made it fun. Like, Jan Bo has great systems, but the problem with his campaign is it's an awful fucking campaign. Like, that's the thing. Faye in isolation looks like a great race. It is a great race, but not the most fun experience, I gotta tell you, in any campaign, because it's just like, you maybe are a bit too strong. There's a combination of factors. I'll talk about those. Still, with Elspeth, like with Karl Franz, you have that focus on diplomacy and various campaign actions, like, population surplus, experience, those kind of things. With Elspeth, you're focusing on gunpowder units, so you might have one of the best ranged armies in the game. You can outrange the High Elves, the Chaos Dwarves, the regular Dwarves, simply because you get so many ridiculous things. The benefit, by the way, with Elspeth, another benefit, is like she actually has a fairly substantial magical benefit associated with her, because her Hellstorm rocket batteries, I think they recharge magic, so winds of magic in battle, so you can have infinite spell casting, I believe it is. I think someone made the Doomstack on that. So she has a really good amount of magic. She has flexibility in moving on the campaign map, even if she doesn't have the best climate situation in the world, but she does have instant teleportation to her army. I've talked about in the past how Foroxiatol's campaign is a really, really nice system, that he has all these that teleportation ability around the world. That is something Elspeth also has. Not quite in the same way. She doesn't have the variety of missions, but she does have that kind of flexibility. So a really powerful spellcasting army, really powerful mobility on the campaign, and really powerful gunpowder army to a ridiculous extent. And she can train units through her unique mechanic. Gelt's whole shtick is that he gets a significant amount of magical benefits. Every single mage of every single type. Some people talk about the downside of that, like, oh, you still want to recruit mages regularly because the traits that they have? Sure, but you get the ability of global recruiting mages and having unique spells for those mages that, well, let me just put it like this. You can be in a situation where one of your settlements is about to go under siege, and you can be attacked by multiple armies. Just summon a couple of mages before that battle and win the battle. I've done this before in this campaign. Winning unwinnable battles that you literally should lose is because of that kind of capability that Gelt has, is ridiculously strong. And I do like the choice system of the campaign. Though The problem with Gelt is kind of a similar issue with Cafe in that he trivializes the game a bit much. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's like every Legendary Lord, when played properly, does that, especially the strong ones. And you can bet your ass that Karl Franz and Elspeth are also very strong Legendary Lords. But still, I think Gelt is a bit too much. On the flip side of Legendary Lords, and the biggest weakness over here is that, yeah, free Legendary Lords are really good, but then you have Volkmar, Marcus Wolfart, then you have Volkmar and Marcus Wolfart, and, well, Volkmar and Marcus Wolfart are... To say that they're pathetic as Legendary Lords would be an understatement. Marcus Wolfart is genuinely not worth playing anymore. He used to be, in the sense that he was not limited by Imperial authority, and that was a benefit, but the hostility meter is really the nail in the coffin in his campaign. And honestly, his focus on archers when we got null iron sides and long rifles, kind of redundant. Yeah, Thrones of Decay made the Beast and the Hunter DLC redundant for the Empire from my perspective. The only thing you might benefit from is like war wagons to some extent, the mortar variant in archers maybe, but not really, doesn't matter. And then Volkmar could be a nice campaign, but he has the rope around his neck that's called the Books of Nagash, and the Books of Nagash system is just not really good one. So you do have that mixed bag of Legendary Lords. The 3 that are really good, and the 2 that are really bad, as the situation of the Empire. I'm kind of sad about Volkmar, because I think he would be actually a lot more interesting if he actually was an alternate start for Karl Franz, as he was for most of his existence, at least after Thrones of Decay. Before Thrones of Decay, yeah, Volkmar had a lot of potential. In some ways, Volkmar is really powerful if you're willing to endure his campaign, but geez, that campaign is a grindy, annoying, and turn-button simulator mess with a annoying start, though it's a cakewalk start nowadays. Wasn't so much before, but nowadays, yeah, with the changes to the Empire, it's very much a cakewalk situation. So that is the situation of the Empire, but then let's talk about the research tree. I can't really say I like it in terms of like, ooh, the decisions you have, because don't get me wrong, there's some really nice stuff over here, hero capacity for various heroes, okay, various economic benefits, lord benefits, experience benefits, army benefits. Sounds great. A lot of it just feels redundant. And I'll be honest with you guys, outside of things like ammunition, which is a really powerful benefit, and reload time reduction, I almost never bother with the military stuff over here. So everything that you see over here at the top, I generally feel is like pointless to even bother with it. Now you can talk about like other races where the military stuff is not as good as the economic stuff, like the dwarves. But that's one thing. It's another thing when it just feels flat out fucking pointless, with the exception of the missile benefits. That's where I stand on that. Because your units, yeah, sure, some of them may not be good enough, but the benefits that you're getting over here, like, okay, 15 armor for infantry units, sure. But consider this, you can get 15 armor for infantry units, or 5% campaign movement range, and a construction time for -1 for resource-producing buildings over there, or a -25% construction time for all buildings, which, yes, does stack with Noble. What do you think is more important over here? I know which one is more important. By the time you can actually get these military technologies reliably unmodded, keep in mind I'm using mods over here that vastly improve the research rate, but if you're playing unmodded, you're just kind of in a situation like, yeah, I always want to get the Imperial colleges, I want to get trade and industry, maybe some colleges of magic, some missile tech, and that's kind of it. That's kind of the research. So it just feels stale. There's some good technology over there, but there's also some meaningless stuff, or stuff that just doesn't feel that substantial. I can say what I want about the dwarf research tree, where, the economic benefits and the guilds are much better than the warrior stuff, the military stuff. But the military stuff is still very substantial, don't get me wrong on that. It's just, yeah, getting instant surplus points whenever you conquer a territory is pretty damn significant for the dwarves. But you also get things like shield wall in the military stuff, so keep in mind that. Like, you can have a situation where you have good technologies and you understand that something is better than others. But here is just feeling redundant. So that, like, the research tree is good, it gets the job done, but also a lot of stuff does feel pretty redundant. Then again, I'm the kind of person who's never been particularly fond of the research tree at any point in Total War history. I have never liked the research tree. I didn't like it in Shogun 2. I didn't like it in Rome 2. I have detested the entirety of the research tree ever since CA decided to add it. Mind you, they added it, in Empire? Though that was a bit different. I gotta say, the situation in Empire and Napoleon was a bit different than the way it ended up going after, because in Napoleon, or rather in Empire, you could capture more colleges that would do their own different research, so you'd be researching multiple things at the same time. That was a much better system than what we ended up with at the moment, I would dare say. Just not fond of it at all, really. And the Empire research tree is less exciting than the research tree of quite a few other races, from my perspective. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.